Hi everyone, welcome to the problem solving session 11 for conservation geography, which is a course offered by NPTEL. And we will be continuing our discussion on human geography as we did in the last session, but this time with the more focus on the economics of it. So this module, or the module that was covered this week, was economic geography and conservation, and the lectures this week looked into transport and communication networks, trade, and settlements. And as always, we will be going over each of these lecture one by one. So let's start with the first lecture, which is on transport and communication system. So, as you can guess by the name itself, what would the uh, lecture cover? The lecture will cover about how humans are persisting in their environment due to transport and communication network, and how transport and communication network have also undergone development because there is a concurrent development in for like concurrent development in the human populations. The number is growing, the density is growing, they are shifting from one side, from place to another, and that's all because of certain demands. And one of these demands is also transport and the communication network. So we will see what are these different type of networks and how are they increasing globally, and how does that look like when we talk about conservation implications. So let's see. So of course, I am pretty sure that anyone talks to you about transport network, you will have a lot of options that comes to your mind. It can be road transport, it can be airways, it can be waterways, it can be railways. So you have all these different transport mode, and if you talk about goods and carriages, they are the same as well. So you have, as you can see on this slide, which is very well summarizing the networks that we have for transportation globally. We have airways here, we have roadways, we have waterways, and we also have railways. So all these, what are their underlying theme, or what are they trying to achieve? They're trying to increase the connectivity across the globe so that people across the globe feel connected. They're able to they're able to move from one place to another, and that helps in migration, that helps in exchange of commodities, that helps in, as we will see, trade. So all of these are underlined by these, like availability of transport networks. So we will look into all of these networks. How are they spread across the world? So this is a summarizing image, if you see. So all the ones in the black color on this slide shows the urban areas. The green one shows the roadways. So if you look at green region on this figure, those are the roads that are present globally. And as you can see, there is high density of roads in the North America and South America, and then you have Africa, and then you can see it's also spread over Europe and Asia and Australia. But you also have some patches where there is no road, which are marked by these blackened areas. You also see them absent in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. So, what is this trying to say? That there are some regions that is yet not accessible by humans, and you will see that human densities are also very less in these regions because they're not able to access, they're not able to go at least by a road here. So this is showing you how there is disparity between road networks. Now talking about shipping routes or the waterways, if we look at what so when we're talking about road, we're also talking about railways. Now shipping routes are shown by blue, and you can imagine it's all across the waterways connecting one place to another. And similarly, if you see airways, you have them connecting different places to each other. Let's look into them in a bit more detail one by one. So this is global road density, and as you can see, this corroborates with what we just saw in the previous slide. The blue here shows less road density. Red one shows very high density, and you can see some regions have very high road connectivity, while some regions have very little to less road connectivity. Some regions are inaccessible by roads, and that hinders people's movement across these regions. Talking about railways, if you look at railways, you see railways are concentrated at few portions in several parts of the world. So example, you see a lot of railways or railroads in Americas, South Americas, many of them in the Europe. India has a lot of railroads. But if you contrast that to the majority of Africa, majority of the Asia and Australia, you see a very barren land. That means there is no rail connectivity in these regions. So that will affect how people will move from one region to another region. The ones that are connected by these rail routes will have more people traveling and more people present there as compared to the ones where there is no connectivity. Because obviously, if there's no connectivity, people will not want to move to such regions. So the next that we see is the shipping or the waterways, and it's very clear, right? The waterway is very well connected. It's all across the major oceans that we have, and every port. If you see, so you don't have ports here though. In the central portion of, especially Asia, you hardly have any waterways there. But for the other continents, the one which faces these oceans, they have very high connectivity even via waterways. Lastly, coming to air traffic, which is not that difficult to understand. Air traffic, this is of 2015, and as of 2024, you do know that there are new airports coming up in different regions of the, especially our country and of the world, and which is increasing the connectivity even via air traffic. So you have more air traffic now. You can see how, and in some regions, you can see the traffic flow is way too high as compared to some regions, and that's because those are hubs. People keep traveling back and forth there. They demand more people's attention, and they encourage more people to come to there. That's because of the facilities there, that's because of the opportunities there, that's because of several other features of, for example, what's the level of the accommodation there, how is the lifestyle there. So all these factors together contribute how does a person decides where to go if he wants to settle somewhere. And you can see there are so many regions that can visibly point out as hotspots, which attract more people. Remember the push and pull factors, these have more pull factors, and this is why you see more people, more transport in these regions. But transport doesn't only stop at this. We also have submarine cables. That's also a way of transport, and that also you can see is spread across the global ocean. Connectivity is because of the submarine cable as well. But these are all a transport mode. But we were also talking about network. If not transport, if not railroads, if not airways, you definitely have phone in your hand and a computer with you, or you at least have a cell phone with you, which helps you connect to other regions, other places, other people, and that is also increasing the connectivity. That is equally contributing to being connected and feeling connected among humans. So again, here also you can see that so many regions and so many places all over the globe are now connected over the uh, communication network as well, and all of these is leading to enhanced connectivity. And that is the whole idea here, that there's all these different modes are contributing to how people are being connected with each other. So I have been using the word network again and again and again. Let's just formally look at what network is. So network is basically, if you really have to define, they are a set of nodes that are joined by links to form a pattern, but they also have serious conservation implication that we should be mindful of, and that's exactly why this whole concept or this topic has found a place in this course. So network is anything that is connected to each other. A communication network, a railway network, a road network, any network is basically one node, set of node, which is, let's say, a hub where a lot of connections are going out, and this node are getting connected to each other by all these different links, and all of these make up a network. And but all these different road transport and railway transport and air transport have their own associated problem. One of the first thing that should come up to your mind if you think about airways or railways or roads is the amount of pollution they do. Second, to lay any railroad or road construction, you cut down a lot of forest. Even for airport, if you have to build that big a space, you generally do cut trees, and that leads to deforestation, and we have discussed now. We have seen in waterways there can be spillage in the ocean, and that can lead to several problems for the environment there. So that's again an associated problem. If you have more demand for shipping, you have more ships moving in the ocean, and there are more chances of such spillage. So that also is the implication that we are trying to highlight here. Now, I have discussed several of the problems, but let's look at one of the most prominent problem that is there because of enhanced connectivity, and this was also extensively discussed in the lecture series. This is the linear infrastructure. Linear infrastructure is basically this is traversing to some kind of infrastructure which is traversing to something in a linear manner. Now you have your images on this slide which shows you towards the left. This image here is a railway network. This image here is a road network. Now, these, of course, like I said, the first thing that you will think if you talk about road connection or railway connection is the pollution level that they generate. So, for roads, you can see like it has light pollution, it has noise pollution, and it has air pollution. This is a photo from, I mean, I guess at least the first two are definitely from Delhi, where you can see on the left it's air pollution, and you can see people wearing masks while moving through the roads. Next is a sound pollution where you have a lot of traffic and people are busy just making sound honks. But on the right, you have light pollution, which is too much of light also can lead to a lot of problems for driving. You can see a lot of distractions suddenly because of too much light, and that is also equally problematic. But what is also a problem that is concurrent with roads is this wildlife encounter. And this, I'm sure you would have seen images like this from, wildlife safari or a trip which is planned within some jungle reserve. And you will often see these jeeps and these vehicles which are traveling with people, and they are meant to for scouting or they are meant for the safari, and they have forest guards or they have trained individuals with them, and you do see such kind of encounters. But that's not about it. That's not just all. It's not just these trained forest officials who take you on the ride. This sometimes also is not just inside the jungle. It's inside a protected area. It's adjoining regions which are habitats for animals. It's adjoining regions. It's between two patches which animals use. It's between, let's say there are two regions, and there is a or maybe a reserve, you can imagine, and you have cut through a road in between so that people can now use this land. But then what you have done is you have fragmented your habitat into two regions, and there are animals on this side and animals on this side. And now these animals also equally use the road because they also have to cross this patch and move to other part of the land. Now what happens because of this? This is the issue. These are roadkills. You can see why is this problematic? Because these animals are dying because of interaction with on incoming cars, and that is because the road there is created in such a way, or it is in in between their space that is used for movement. So these are very common sight, and you see every animal being affected by the oncoming population or incoming cars, right? And when does this become a problem? When do you say that, okay, I will not build a road because it is creating problem? It's not always, and it's not that it's the number varies. It's there's a defined phenomena which you can say and detect. So let's first look at this and then try to explain it. So here's an image to show you how the cars which or the traffic on the road affects the animals who are trying to use that road. Okay, so on the x-axis here is mean traffic, number of cars which are moving through that road per day, and on the y-axis you have percentage of animals who are attempting to cross the barrier. Now successful means that they have moved to that other patch, and successful will account for them being surviving when they are crossing the patch and moving on to another land and moving ahead. Repelling is when they don't move at all. So let's say they have to move from A to B. This is a road in between, but they don't even try to attempt to leave A and reach to B via this road. They stay in A and be there permanently, right? But then there is a slight region in between. That's when they are moving from A to B, and let's try to see what's happening there. So intuitively, this dashed line here is successful for successful movement. These dashed lines, the smaller dashed lines here, are for the repels, and the ones in like the dashes and the short dashes, that's for kill. Now, intuitively, if you have less vehicle or if no vehicle on the road, then you can see that the curve for successful crossing is the highest, and the ones for repel and killed is also lowest, which is intuitive. If there is no car, they can easily move from here to there. This continues till a certain point. So you increase the car, let's say, to 2000 cars per day. What happens as you increase the car, the number of successful attempts reduces, number of killing is increasing, so it hasn't yet reached the threshold, and number of repulsion is also increasing, but at a very like at a very short way, because what happens here is for the animal to realize that I shouldn't be crossing this road, it has to first learn that okay, there are cars incoming and I am not supposed to go ahead, because if I get hit by this incoming car, I will be dead and I will not be able to move, and it will affect me very severely. For the animal to get sensitized to that fact, it takes time. So this ripple is for if you have less number of cars frequenting on the road, the animal doesn't get to learn it quickly. Now contrast it with where you have 10,000 cars moving on that road. That means it's a heavily used road. The animals quickly start to imagine, because get distracted because there are way too many cars. First thing is they cannot move itself because there are constantly cars coming, and though they now know that there's no space for them to move. Second, there's too much of light, so that distracts them a lot and they do not even attempt to move. The light keeps them awake. Third, sound is the most distracting thing for an animal, and if it's trying to move and it suddenly hears a car coming in a speed or honking, it gets scared and it still stays still. But when it's too many cars, it doesn't even attempt to like leave the boundary. It stays on the boundary. It has learned now that I do not want to go. So you see, when there is too many cars, like absolutely high density, the repelling is way too higher, so there is no movement, and concurrently the killings also go down and the successful is negligible, understandably so, right? But then you have a region in between where you have moderate number of cars. The car number is not that high that the animal doesn't have space to move, and it's not that low that the animal can move successfully. This you can imagine as a random spurt of cars coming, or some cars coming randomly. Now the animal doesn't know that the car is coming because it's not used to this. And the animal, when it hears, as discussed in the lecture, an animal in the wild, if it is moving and if it senses a predator, it stops, because for it, if it so imagine in wild when you have these thick bushes and grasses, if you're moving, there is movement and the predator can sense your movement. If you see a predator and stay freeze, the predator loses your sight and cannot guess where you are anymore, and you have saved your day. So this is the instinct of the animal, and this animal is doing the same when it's trying to cross the road and suddenly it sees a car. Instead of running away, it stops right there, thinking, okay, I am not moving anymore, the predator will not see me. But the car person who's driving the car, if he's not like privy enough to such kind of changes, he'll not even get time to reduce his speed, and that leads to the loss of the roadkill that you see. So this is the barrier effect, where you have this intermediate number of cars going and the animals haven't learned yet, and every time they're trying to cross the road, some or the other thing is distracting them, be it the light, be it the sound, be it just the movement of something coming, and they get frozen, or they are hit by the car, or they are not even looking for it, and the car is not the driver is not sensitized enough, so they move, they encounter, and it more often than not leads to the death of the wild animals. And this is what is shown in the middle portion, where you have moderate number of cars. So your, of course, successful goes down. You are still in the intermediate zone of repelling, but there's extremely high number of killing. And this is what is the deadly trap. And this is what being touted as that this is not feasible. So you either have very little car, or you completely create a barrier effect such that the animals don't get to move. But that's again very problematic. So there's a cutoff of how much cars you can have, how many cars you can have, and how many you can allow such that it doesn't lead to a deadly trap, right? So, barrier effect, however, these regions in the center and the depths there can be reduced if these things are followed. First is traffic intensity. So, like we said, more traffic creates a wall. So, this you can keep in mind that okay, let's just create a wall and not let animals move at all. That's fine. You're not letting them move, letting them stay in their place. That has another consequences. But if you are really concerned with not killing the animals, that's the thing that you can imagine. Or you put speed breakers on the road, or signpost for the maximum permissible speed limit. So you can control the vehicle speed. You can talk to driver, and you can sensitize them about the head of use of headlights, the horns that they use for, because like I mentioned, all of these have impact on the animals. Then you can have crossings for animals which are only meant for animals crossing, but their location has to be apt enough. And then you also consider the movement and the pattern of their movement, and where do they move, which area do they frequently use, can we bypass those regions and then make these roads. Next is species specific preference of road use, which species prefer more and how do. So all of these are interconnected with each other. Road edge effects is that you are making a road, what if you give embankments on the sides and that doesn't allow the movement at all, so that again stops the animal from moving. And then you have lastly you have how many species is there to determine that do you really need to build a proper barrier, or can you be with limited number of vehicles, and what time of the day and the year are preferred by the species. So let's say these animals there have seasonal migration, so at those seasons you can try and control the vehicle numbers so that these animals can move safely, and then later you again revoke these all restrictions and let the cars move because there's no animals to move there. So all these can be taken into account when you're thinking about barrier effect, and that helps people plan how to navigate through the road building. But roadkill is not the only issue. Like I mentioned, building roads or making roads in between such regions can lead to fragmentation of habitat that we have already discussed, and is very clearly showing you in this image, right? There was a contiguous forest that has now been patched into several different regions, and I think we have discussed innumerable times during the course of these problem solving session that what could be the possible problem associated with habitat fragmentation and habitat loss and habitat degradation. uh, so people also do this, they just clear off the forest that I have been telling you, and they expect them to grow back, but this is not how a forest will grow back, and the reason is very well discussed in the lecture. If you just cut off the tree from between, it doesn't mean that it is all its cells remaining. There are dead cells removed, there are tissues removed, there are important systems that have been removed, which requires which is the requirement of the plant to grow. So just keeping part of the plant and thinking that it will help to regrow, it is not the way to go forward. And if it doesn't even lead to death of animal, there are so many other things that can happen. Human wildlife conflict is a very big thing, and you can see here on this slide the images are showing that how humans can be a victim too in such cases. It's not always the case that the animals are dead, it's the humans also can be the victims in these cases. As you can see on the left, elephant just getting crazy and angry and just stumbling over the car, and on the right you have peers crossing, and they are sensing humans, and that can be very dangerous situation. But they can also do something else. They can also change the animal behavior, and this is sight, it's very frequent in India. And I can say that for myself because I know how these langurs and monkeys they use these roads, especially in and around temples, and how they change behavior based on their interaction with humans. And this human interaction with animals is increasing because of the availability of roads. They are now more, tolerant of humans. They actually depend on humans for their food, and they will be behind you for your food. And the behavior completely changes. The stance changes now that when they see humans. So like the use of roads by animals can have a lot of effect, but they also change them how they behavior is. So what do we do for this? So we talked about road. You either put it as an extreme wall or you have very little cars because intermediate cars don't work. So what do? You can't always build a proper barrier, right? So what do? You build something like this. What does it look like? Before I give you the term, you see there's a patch of land here. There's a patch of land here as well, and you have built a road in between, and you have put embankments on these sides so animals can't move in. So how do the animals move? The animals move via this road, which is okay. You have high embankments so they don't fall off, and they can easily cross from this road to another, this road to that road. That is called a corridor or a land bridge. Exactly what we're talking about. Now, this land bridge can be over the road or under the road. It can be beneath the road that is built, so that animals can move easily from one land to another. You can also have canopy bridges, which are very high. If you have trees on both sides of the large trees, huge patches of large size trees, you can have these canopy bridges where the arboreal animals can make use of these bridge and move from one region to another. This I wanted to show that such kind of plans are already in action, and this is a proposed underpass for elephants. This is proposal for the Dehradun, and you can see that what they are proposing is they are building a road, and there's an underpass which allows the movement of elephant from one region to another. So this way, neither the elephant is hurt, neither the incoming public who are using those roads. So this is a very sustainable way, and this looks really a way to go forward. Other than just having bridges, you can also have such glider poles. So if there are animals who move from one pole to other, you can have these poles across the roads, and instead of using these roads, the animals can move from one pole to other, so they can glide from one pole to the other. Or you can have this kind of pulverts where you have these embankments, and you make a passage out of it and you let the animals use it. So you have pulverts, and pulverts can be pipe pulverts or box pulverts depending on how you are using it. Your main purpose here is that the animal can also use it and for its own purpose, so embankment and or staying or using it for its own purpose. So you are also giving a habitat for the animal to be. And this is a very interesting proposition. So most of the times what you see for reptiles especially, who reptiles require basking. They are ectothermic, so they have to modulate their body temperature. So most of the times you will see snakes especially, they come onto the road to bask, to like if it's too hot they will come on the road to cold, if it's too cold then they will come onto the road to if there's patch of sunlight that's falling. So they most often come on the road to have these kind of basking behavior. So what can be done to avoid the reptiles to come onto the road is, why not provide a basking site right on the patches on either side of the road. So as you can see very nicely in this image, this is a road in between and you have two patches, and you have made this very nice basking site so that the snake can be there. These are basically concretes where the animals or the snakes can go and bask, and they, if they bask there, they don't have to move on to this land anymore, and they are also safe. So this is a very good plan for reptiles, unlike what we saw for mammals. So snakes generally don't rely on bridges here. They are more concerned with basking. That's exactly why they use road. They are also not concerned with underpasses. They can make use of any habitat if they have to. But what is more important is them being ectothermic and changing their body temperature according to the conditions. They don't need canopy bridge. They'll not need glider pools because they have nothing to do. But yes, there are arboreal, so that connectivity will help them moving, but they primarily are not using roads. And perverts can help them stay, but what is more important, according to the physiology and behavior of a reptile, is that you provide basking sites for these reptiles here. Right. So we have looked into how their connectivity by different mode of transport, railways, airways, roads are increasing, and what are the possible problem associated with it. And in that we mainly studied the human wildlife conflict aspect, which is a very important concept if you want to talk about conservation. And that brings me to the end of this first lecture, and I've summarized the entire lecture into 10 questions, and these will of course serve as guidelines or a guide for you to revise when you are doing it for your exams. So let me read out the questions and you can attempt to see and if you are getting the right answer, and of course I will give you the answers and discuss if it didn't make sense or it is not clear. The first question is a linear infrastructure. They are physical and organizational structure. So there are two things here. So do you think both of them are correct or the statement is wrong? Which of these, next question, is a factor governing barrier effects of road? So barrier effect is basically the road acting as a barrier to the movement of animals. And when do we say that this road is behaving as a barrier? Third is, dust and sulfur dioxide are contributed by which of the following mode of transport network? So which one among these four do you think contributes most to sulfur dioxide and dust as a pollution effect? And second last is, which of these are examples of mitigation measures to mitigate impacts of linear infrastructure that we have discussed right now? And last one here is, which of these result due to animal and human interaction? So we have again two options here. Which one do you think is correct? I'll just wait for maybe 1 minute and then we can quickly discuss the answers. Okay, so let's look into the answers. The first one is linear infrastructure, a basic physical and organization structure. So that's okay. Just a second. I think I received response. So let me just quickly look at the responses. Okay. So while you are looking to give the fourth and fifth answer, let me just discuss the first three and see if that matches with your fourth and fifth. So like I said, first one is true because a linear infrastructure, for example, the roads that we have seen, they are physical, yes, because they are of course being built on the ground, but they're also organization because anything that you build on top or build a structure as, you always have the linear structure as its basic layer. So that's what it's meant by organizational structure. So when you talk about a linear infrastructure, that's the first base. So that's organization as well as the physical structure. Next is, which of these is a factor for governing barrier effect? Road edge features. So basically where they are and how many embankments, how tall the embankments are. Time and day of the year is basically when does a species use the road. Species diversity is how many species are there, that will determine what kind of movement is there, and that's all of these is the correct answer, which is correct. Next is dust and sulfur dioxide and contributed by waterways, as was discussed in the lecture, where it was shown that when you are talking about shipping lanes, dust and sulfur dioxide is the problem associated with increasing shipping. That's because dust, as you know, attracts a lot of pollution. It gives them, if we had discussed this when we were talking about water, like hydrosphere, that dust basically gives serves as a nucleus where all the pollution comes and all the matters comes and gets deposited, and we read it in perspective of cloud formation, but that's also true for other features as well. So dust and sulfur dioxide come from water base. So which of these are mitigation? Bridge underpass we have seen, right? So bridge underpass is basically underpass which is allowing the movement of animals below the road that has been created. Box culverts and pipe culverts are basically again under the road, and they are along the as we will see what exactly when we are exactly using culverts. And the last is which of these are resulting because of human and animal interaction. Change in behavior we have seen, right? The monkeys are now more tolerant to humans, and they don't have resilience anymore. I mean, they don't even resist anymore to human presence. And spread in disease as well, because you never know what kind of zoonotic disease you might get or what kind of diseases they might get from us. So that is also a possible result when there is interaction between animals and humans, right? Moving to the next five questions which summarize this chapter, and then we move on to the next lecture of this week. So the first question here is which of these could not happen due to animals using road? Next, what is constructed over the road so that the animals can move from one part of habitat to other? Third, which of this is a factor governing barrier effect of roads again? Last, which of these is often needed in those areas where some amount of filling operation has been done? And lastly, which of these are example of mitigation measures to mitigate impacts of linear infrastructure? Again, I will wait 1 minute and then we can quickly discuss the answers. Okay. Okay. So I've received response. Okay. Let me give you the answers and discuss them as well. Okay. So, first one is which of these could not happen due to animal using roads? Change in behavior, death, and human wildlife conflict we have discussed and lightly mentioned. Increased migration is not a result of animal using roads, right? When we are talking about roads prospectively, specifically here, we are talking about all the problems associated with this usage. Next is dash is constructed over the road. So the over the road is the key word here. Land bridge is being over the road. Canopy is between tall trees and tall, branches. Bridge underpass is basically the same thing, land bridge, but beneath the road. And pipe culverts are not built across the roads, right? Next is which of these is governing factor for barrier road? If traffic intensity, driver sensitivity, and speed of vehicles we have discussed. Traffic intensity, if too high, acts as complete barrier. Too low is not causing any problem. If it is intermediate, it is there that you have most of the killings of the animals. Driver sensitivity, if you sensitize the driver about the problems associated with sudden lights and horns and glaring and extreme speed, that will reduce the effect of barrier effects on the roads and animals. Next is dash is often needed in those areas where some amount of filling operations. So if you have basically culverts is basically just to if you have dug up a region after filling the this thing bu- uh, earth back, you put a barrier or a concrete around it to hold the water. That's culvert, and that's what you can also use this for animals. Is what the idea is when we are suggesting that you can use these for a mitigation purpose. And lastly, land bridge, canopy bridge, glider poles, as we have discussed, they are all ways of mitigating the impacts of linear infrastructure on wildlife. So that concludes this first lecture, which is about how roads impact wildlife. Now let's move on to another aspect of human economy, which is trade. Now, trade, which is very a common thing that we see in today's life, right? You want to buy something, you go to market and you buy it up. You want to sell something, you put it up as if as a common person you want to sell something, you give a certain price and someone else buys it from you. So trade is a very common thing, but let's try to look at it from a economic perspective here. So, the transfer of goods and services from one person or an entity to another, sometimes as barter, sometimes mostly actually in exchange of money, that's trade, right? As you can see. So, you are seeing there is trade exchange of money here for some commodity, and trade involves so many factors. They involve import, transfer, export, shipment, partnership, distribution. All these are, like they are all part of the umbrella term trade. So, what does trading give to you? Why do you trade? You trade because of access to different goods, right? If there is international trading, you are getting access to international goods. There is potential for economies of scale. So, if there is a small company that also trades, that also increases their visibility and their income, the same goes for a bigger company. A bigger company also wants to achieve the same thing, but by trading, and trading is giving the common platform to all these different communities. It increases competition. So trade, if there is trade, let's say there's a demand for a particular commodity, let's say clothing, and there are two companies which are in this trade, and because now the buyer has an option of buying from A or B, there is competition between A and B to give better quality, a good price, such that the customer buys more of their product. So you have competition, and this competition is very healthy because it is increasing and enhancing the quality of the good. And of course, the whole idea here is to generate economy, and that's why it generates economic growth and adds global value, because when you are trading, you are making yourself visible, and that gives value to you and your commodity or your product. And that comes with several social and cultural benefits and several other factors that uh, give you several other endowments. So you trade so that you get a lot of these getting in work for you. But what exactly is trade, and when do you exactly trade? When do you actually go think that okay, I should trade and I should not be trading is me basically saying okay, I'll buy this from this person. Why should I buy and why can't I make it? That is also like that is also very logical. So let's see these different cases which have been discussed in the lectures. Now, case one, there are two people, let's say person A and person B. Person A does one thing, person B does one thing. And if I take the example from your lecture, one person here, or maybe what is there on the slide? There are two farmers. One of the farmer can only produce potato. The other farmer can only produce milk. So these two, if they are to stay and if they are to buy stuff, they have to trade. The one who knows how to make potatoes give potatoes in return for milk from the one who knows how to make milk. So both the farmers are fulfilling each other's requirement by like producing the other amount in extra so that they can trade for it. So here, when in such a community, when one person knows only one stuff, the trade becomes inevitable because you cannot escape it. How otherwise will you get access to potato? But now let's look into this. This is uh, with your different with a difference in the absolute advantage. Now let's see. So here you can see, right, farmer one is producing milk. Now if the farmer one decides that I don't want to produce milk, I want to produce potato, let's just do it. And the farmer two decides, okay, I will not produce milk, I mean I will not produce potato, I will produce the other thing just to try my hand it, and I want to know how better I can do. I am a farmer, I should be able to grow. What's the problem in that? But what happens is, when the farmer one tries to produce something else other than what he's an expert of, his productivity rate goes down. Similarly, when the farmer two, instead of producing potato, tries to attempt to produce milk, their milk productivity goes down. They could have produced much better content of potatoes if they had invested full day at work. But now, because they are producing milk, even if they attempt to give the entire day, they produce very little amount of milk. This is problematic because my absolute advantage is getting affected. I can produce both of them, but if I produce this, I am more efficient than if I produce the other commodity. So, and the other person in front of me does the opposite better. So why not let him do the milk thing and I produce my potato and we exchange it for trade. So in such cases where your absolute advantages, this is absolute advantage. How much advantage do you have if you are able to produce both of them, and how much you get in return? If the absolute advantage is different, then trade becomes obvious. It's not inevitable, it is not that it is requirement. I can still produce milk and I can still sell my milk and my potato side by side, but both of them at their subpar amount and subpar quantity. So I can maximize my one commodity and I can trade it for the other commodity because the other person is doing a better job at that. So here trade becomes obvious because your idea or your goal here is to maximize your gains. But then there's a third situation here where you have, so there are two farmers. Both the farmers are attempting to do both the things, and then there is one farmer who, if chooses to produce milk, does better than farmer two. If chooses to produce potato, does better than farmer two. So then, should that individual still go for trade? And the answer will be yes, and that is because of their comparative advantage. So we have said absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is the ability to produce a good using fewer inputs than another producer. And if I say I have a lower absolute advantage, that means for producing the same amount of, let's say, milk as compared to other farmer, I have to put in more resources than that person does. So why am I even investing so much and getting nothing in return? But that is absolute advantage. But where comparative advantage is actually when so this is the ability of a producer to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another. And what is the opportunity cost? Whatever must be given to obtain some item. So basically, what are you investing to get a good? So if your comparative advantage is there, where you are putting something to get, let's say, putting my efforts to get produce milk, and that is better than what the other person is doing. So if I have a comparative advantage, then I will go for the then I will decide not to go for trade because I am getting advantage. Let's try to understand this in a better way. So these are the two farmers in question here. The first farmer can produce, it's in totality, okay? So the first farmer can produce 8 units of milk and 32 units of potato. So what you see here is both the farmers can produce both the things. So there is no inevitability. Now the question comes, how does it look when there is such kind of situation? Now, what is the opportunity cost of one milk and one potato? So if you are able to produce your 8 units of milk, so if I decide to produce one unit of milk, how much of potatoes, because I can produce both, right? So if I decide to go for milk, how much of potato am I compromising? So opportunity cost of one unit of milk production is 32 by 8, 4 units of potatoes. So if I have to make one milk or 1 unit of milk, I lose out on 4 units of potato. On the contrary, if I decide to go for potato, if I make 1 unit of potato, I lose out 0.25 portion of milk. Okay, that's my standing, that's something in my mind. That okay, if I'm going for milk production, I lose 4 units of potatoes. If I go for the production of potato, 1 unit of potato, I lose out 0.25 units of milk. Let's compare this to farmer 2. Now the farmer 2 things. Farmer 2 thinks I am producing 24 units of milk and 48 units of potatoes. Looks good, right? More of both of almost both. Yeah, both of more, right? Potatoes is also higher and milk is also higher. Let's look at the opportunity cost. Now, if I produce 1 unit of milk, I lose out 2 units of potatoes. If I go for 1 unit of potato, I lose out 0.25 units of milk. Now, how do you decide who does what? You put a opportunity cost table like this. Farmer 1 for 1 unit of milk loses 4 units of potatoes. Farmer 2 for 1 unit of milk loses 2 units of potatoes. Farmer 1 for 1 unit of potato loses 0.25 units of milk. Farmer 2 for 1 unit of potato loses 0.5 units of milk. Now, what you will see is to produce certain quantity whose loss is lesser. So, if you are, just a second. So, once again, what you see in opportunity cost is to produce 1 unit of milk whose loss is lesser. So, if I am to look at milk, farmer 1 is losing 4 units, farmer 2 is losing 2 units. Whose loss is lesser? Farmer 2. So, farmer 2 say, I will go for milk production. If I am to produce 1 unit of potato, farmer 1 loses 0.25 units of milk. Farmer 2 loses zero point 0.5 units of milk. Whose loss is lesser? Farmer 1. So when you look at the comparative advantage, farmer 1 says, okay, I am going for my potatoes, and farmer 2 says, okay, I'm going for my milk, because my comparative advantage looks better like that. I have a lower. So when you go back to the formula or the definition of comparative advantage, it says the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. So whichever has lower, the producer favors that, and that's when you trade. Because why do you trade? Because the comparative advantage is different for each of them. So you both are producing different things, of course, and then it boils down to the same fact that you trade to get the other commodities. So your trade is determined by absolute advantage, comparative advantage, opportunity cost, right? So all this determine if you go in for trade or not. And this, as I mentioned, trade is in growth. It's in increase exponentially at the international phase. What was very less during the 1800s, you can see it has increased by not just twice, it has increased by 4,000%. So you can imagine how much commodity is there, and how much are people involved in trading, and how much competition in the trading is also giving rise to more avenues of commodities coming up and consumers getting more options. This is the same thing, same map shown from the perspective of exported goods as a share of GDP. So basically, for a country, if you see the gross domestic product, how much of that is coming from exported goods? You export goods as a company only when you have an excess, and if your GDP share is coming mostly as, or 25% of it's coming because of exported, you can imagine how well suited are you for this trading business. So, and that also globally is on the increase. That means there are so many countries that are now focusing on exporting their good, and we will see why we do export and import in the coming slides to make it clear, understandable why are people even doing this. So this also we have discussed. Now trading has its own effect. Trading can be in any circle, but when you do international trades, when you have an international level of business, you are basically doing the same advantage but now at a bigger scale. So you have increased variety of good, you have specialization, permit economies of scale, you have lowering the prices, you have enhanced flow of ideas. You see something getting up, like hold in one of the sectors of your business, you try to take the idea and put it in another sector, and there also you are trying to improvise. So that is also being part of it. Increased competition reduces the market powers of firms and consumers, and enhance surplus and welfare, because that's the ultimate goal. The more the good products, the better the surpluses and better the welfare. Now we come to import and export. When do you import and when do you decide to export? So export. So let's say I am a seller, I am doing trading in my own country, and I'm selling at a certain price to my consumers. What I realize is whatever I am paying, the price that I'm quoting in my country or using for my business is lower than what people are using in international level. So why should I just stay back? I can export my goods and get better money also from the world price, using the world price in the international market. So you export when the world price is more than your domestic price, and you do the opposite. We import when your world price is lower than your domestic price is more than your world price. So your domestic price is so high that you cannot afford to sell it. So you're trying to import stuff and you're trying to enhance your business. So you export when the world price is too high. You import when your world price is lower, right? So the price of the good is what prevails the market uh, in international trading. Now, why do you do that at all? So let's first look at without what is the surplus that we have spoken about. Okay, so this is how your consumer and producer surplus look like. Surplus is basically having extra whatever you're looking at. For a consumer, if I am to say, let's say I go to market with 100 rupees and I buy stuff, and at the end of the day I am left with 10 rupees. Even after shopping everything I needed, I am in a 10 rupees surplus. For a producer who's selling the things to me, let's say he made the thing or he had invested 100 rupees in making something, but he sold the commodity at 110 rupees. That's a 10 rupees surplus for the producer. So this is the kind of surplus that we are talking about here. Now, this S here is supply and this D here is demand. Okay, and this is quantity of the quantity demanded or supplied, and the price which the commodity is attached. So in the beginning, when quantity of the demand is too low, what you see is supply is also too low, and the demand right now is very high because there is nothing. So you will only have demand which is being increasing in the market. Now as your demand increases, your demand is increasing, your production is also increasing. Now when you produce, yeah, you have produced ample to give supply, your supply increases and your demand goes down, right? Now why you look into this from a perspective of price, you see when the demand is too high, your price is also too high. When your demand gets too low, you tend to produce your price at a lower range because you know the demand is not there. So let's put it at a cheaper rate so that it goes away. But same on the contrary, if your supply is also high, then you can quote a price which is higher because you know that it is being used and that's why you are supplying it more. So your price bracket is based on the supply and demand in the graph. And here is where your consumer producer surplus is there. Consumer surplus is when he has spent less money than he was expecting to spend on a certain commodity. That's consumer surplus. So remember this triangle here. These are important when we look at international surplus. And this triangle is for producer surplus. Producer surplus is when the producer has more money gained because of selling a commodity. Okay. Now let's look at this. How does international trade changes this? So international trade, you export. This is for export. You export when the world price is higher than, so this is the domestic price and the world price is higher, right? Remember this triangle here was for consumer price and this triangle here was, sorry, consumer surplus, and this was here for your producer surplus. Now your world price is above domestic price and it is cutting your consumer surplus. So your consumer surplus is basically now diminishing. It is being added to the producer surplus, and you also have these extra commodity which is adding to the surplus of the producer. And that's why the producers or businessmen or traders tend to involve themselves in international trade because as compared to import or compared to domestic trading, if it indulges in exporting, you see their surplus increases by 2 degree and consumers are losing out their surplus by a certain degree, and that's a good overall benefit and gain for the producers. So when the world price is higher, that is in an international market, they produce the commodity is in greater demand, they tend to export it and gain benefit from it. But the opposite is import, you understand, right? Importing is basically you are taking from other company country, so you're also investing money, you're losing out on money. So that way, just imagine if your country itself is importing, you tend to pay much lesser price because at lower price also they will sell because they need to get the commodity. So the consumer surplus is increasing in case of import with the same two factor, that is importing, that is the exporting factor in the, or the factor that is enhancing in the export. and by the same factor it is reducing for the consumers. So you just need to remember that in export, producer surplus is increasing. In import, consumer surplus is increasing. You export when the world price is higher than the domestic price. You import when the world price is lower than domestic price. Okay. Now, why did we even put this here? Why is this a part of conservation geography? Because all this trade environment, you can imagine, right? The more the trade, the more the connectivity, the more the demand, the more the usage. You want to make factory, you want to clear out land because you want to put a factory, you want to use more of raw materials because there is more demand. If it's a timber based industry, it wants to make more use of timber, it fell more trees. So all of these come at an environmental cost. And the question or the underlying implication here is that don't do trade, but do it in a sustainable way. And towards the end of this session today, we'll see a sustainable mode of settlement. Why not think about similar things when trade is coming? How much can you cap at an international scale so that the demand and the profits and the supply all go hand in hand and in a sustainable manner? So, this is where the chapter and lecture ends with the thought for you to ponder if environment also gains equal importance when thinking about trade. And that brings me to an end of this lecture as well. And similarly, I have put 10 questions which summarize the entire lecture in 10 questions and gives you a roadway to revise your chapter. Quickly we'll do this. It will not take much time, and then we'll go to settlements, which is the last lecture today, and which will also cover how can you have sustainable settlements. So coming to these questions here, the first one is, what is defined as whatever must be given up to obtain some item? So which of these are basically related to this definition? Next is computer revolution. So basically coming of computer and now the enhancement of computer. This is an example of what kind of advantage of international trade. So among all these different advantages, which one does computer revolution fall into? Next is the price of the trade, whatever price you are using or citing for, which is determined by what and or the opportunity cost of both the players. So what is actually determining the price of the trade? Next is the ability to produce a good using fewer inputs than another producer. These are all definition and because definitions are very specific here, that's why I wanted you to pay for attention here. So which of these refers to this definition? And the last one is, what is the outcome when either of the person can produce only one good? This is from the scenario where we have seen when does trade become inevitable and when it becomes obvious. So I'll wait for 1 minute for you to ponder on these questions and then come back and give you the answers for it. EXPLDC. Okay, so I've received response, so let me give you the answers. Yes. Okay, so the first one is dash is defined at whatever must be given up to obtain some item. Remember, we talked about opportunity cost when we were making those table. So it's called opportunity cost. Next is computer revolution is an idea of enhanced flow of ideas, which was very correct. The price of the trade is determined by opportunity cost, and we discussed opportunity cost with comparative advantage. So be mindful of these terms. This is important when from your exam perspective as well. The ability to produce a good using fewer inputs than another producer, that is absolute advantage. Where we are not talking about opportunity cost or not talking about lowered opportunity cost. We are just talking about inputs, whatever I am putting into it. The last one is what is the outcome when either person can produce only. So if one of the person can only produce one good, trade is inevitable because there is no, you as a person yourself, you cannot produce the other thing. So how do you get the other thing? You only get it by trading. So this could be confusing. So when you are revising or when you are reading, just take a minute and try to imagine the scenario, and it will become very easy. It's very easy as a concept to understand. Okay, so last five questions here. The first one is the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. Which one is this? Next is which of this is correct with regards to export? So under what condition here do we see export? Next, which of this is not an advantage of trade, international trade? Next is which one is odd one out with respect to major export origin countries? So which of the country do you think is not a major export in international trade? Lastly, what is the outcome when people have different absolute advantages? Okay, so I have received a response. I will give the answers because this. Sorry for this here. Yeah, you can cross check your answers if they were correct. The first one is the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer is comparative advantage. Where you are comparing yourself with the other producer, and you're looking at if I am putting all resources in it, how much am I getting out of it? That is comparing yourself with the other. You, because in absolute you're just looking at yourself. I'll go back to the so here it's basically, if you see absolute, it's the ability of producing a good using fewer inputs. It's just how much you are putting. But when you talk about whatever you have, you're putting into a commodity, that's comparative advantage. Okay, when the world price is higher than domestic price, that leads to export. Next is international trade leads to everything but reduced competition. It increases competition, which is increasing the quality of the product. And major exporter countries, India is not a part of it. The other countries are definitely part of it, and it's in the lectures. You can check it once again. And lastly, when different people have different absolute advantages, trade becomes obvious, not inevitable. Remember, inevitable is something that you have to do. Obvious is you have a choice of doing, but you choose to do it because it gives you more benefit. So that's the difference. All these are very easy to understand, and they are not a difficult concept. They will take a little time, but if you sit back and think about it, imagine the scenario, it plays out very easily. Okay, moving on to the last lecture for this week, and it's very easy, it's not that difficult, and we'll do this quickly as well. So lastly, here today we talk about settlements. So just a second. Yeah. So settlements is basically how populations are spreaded, how they are present, and we have seen this in the previous lecture. How disparate the global population is. Some regions have very high population, some regions have very low population, all depending on which one has more pull factors, which one has more resources, where the accessibility to resources is higher. All this determines how much proportion of the global population that region have support. When we talk about settlement is how, what kind of dwelling these population harbor. They can be present in small cities, small towns, big like a city. So you're on the slide, you can see, right, on the level of how these dwellings are. So here, if you go from the base of the triangle to the high up in the triangle, you see there is an increase in the size of settlement, higher population and more services. So that goes increasing, but the frequency of these as a unit in the country decreases. I'll explain what does that mean, right? So isolated dwelling, they have the most frequency, and because they have the smaller size, smallest size is of a isolated dwelling. Many isolated dwelling coming together make up a hamlet. Many hamlet make up a village which is slightly bigger than hamlet, or your size is increasing, but as you increase in size your frequency goes down. Then you have a small town, then you have a large town, then you have a city, and then you have a final conurbation, or like a municipal city, or even bigger city that you want to name it as. So as your like the structure and type of settlement increases, your township or your city, this also keeps on changing. So these are the patterns. So you can imagine, right? So you can see here, let's start from the left part. Houses which are very distant from each other, those are dispersed. Nucleated is basically a cluster which is very separated from the rest of the world. That's nucleated. They are very close to each other, but they are separated from the remaining world. Linear is everything one after the other. So you will see a lot of housing societies or bungalows in any sector-wise regions that if you've seen, they have a linear kind of approach. And then you have isolated, which is one house after a lot of area. So all of these are settlement patterns, and they are governed by many factors, and not just money, or not just area. It depends on what kind of religion you're following, what kind of cultural setup you have, what kind of social setup you have. All these together with the finances and the availability of land make up the settlement patterns. So again, you can see here a nucleated pattern, a dispersed pattern, and a semi-nucleated. A nucleated basically a lot of housing coming together and forming an isolation and separated from the other. Semi-nucleated is basically if you reduce this in number and then put them side by side, but again together they are separated from the remaining world. Hamlet settlements is something like Palli. You would have heard Palli, Panna, these kind of words a lot. So this is basically, you can see these image and very well imagine what is a hamlet settlement. You have that lot of houses, but all of them within a particular boundary, and that boundary is also shed siding, or keeping them isolated from a lot of other regions. So they have their own little world which is separated from the other regions. So that's Palli, that's Panna. You will see that it's also there in India as well. Now, settlements can also be of two different categories broadly. There are rural settlement, and then there is urban settlement. Rural settlement have isolated mostly. Now, whatever name I have taken, I'm pretty sure images would have cropped up in your mind, and you would have already classified them as rural and urban. That's because that's exactly how many times we have seen them like that. So isolated settlements or hamlet or village, you see them as rural settlement. They're mostly pertaining to countryside. So majority of the inhabitants in developing countries, as we know, they live in rural areas. Urban areas, which is something like town, which have more population, more amenities, more facilities, they are larger towns or cities, or even metropolises, which are in our country, but only few cities or few such places. So these are developed regions. These are have, and as a country, if you are a developed country, you have more of urban areas. As a country, if you are in a developing country, if you're classified as a developing country, you have more of rural areas. So when do you call a place as town? When do you call it a city? A town is classified as on the number of your population. How many population do you have? How many of them do you have? And what kind of facility do you have? There also you have two kind of towns. So first is statutory town. It's basically all places within a municipality or a corporation. So there will be a municipal corporation, and all the places beneath it is a town. Or you have a census town. Census town is basically based on the number of people. Census is number of people. So all places which satisfy the following criteria. There has to be 5,000 population. At least 75% of the male working population engage in non-agricultural pursuits, and a density of population at least 400 persons per square kilometer. Now, what do you see here? You see that population is large, and the males, basically the working class, most of them are contributing to not agriculture, because agriculture is where you are farmer and you are producing stuff, but something else. What is something else? A paid job, some kind of
activities which doesn't involve agriculture, which basically means you have to study, you have to get jobs in offices or move out, put your own businesses, stuff like that, which is nothing to do with agriculture. And lastly, you need a square kilometer. Per square kilometer you have 400%. How densely populated you are and how much of land would you need to have. So you automatically, the size of the place is increasing, number of people is increasing, and the level of literacy and the commodities and the amenities that you have in those regions also increase. So you see automatically it's a switch from a city or a village to a town. Among town also, based on now how many number of people you have different classes. It starts from class 6 being the one with the minimal amount, after of course 5,000 minimal number of people, to as more as 1 lakh people, you have a class 1 town, right? Towns can also be classified based on the primitive identifying feature in that place. For example, New Delhi, all the higher offices, central offices, all the main offices are basically in that place. So that's called an administrative town. Bhilai has most of these factories and manufacturing units. So it's an industrial town. Vishakhapatnam has a port, a dockyard. So it's a transport town. Saharanpur is a commercial town. Similarly, you have Singrauli, Mao, Oxford. Oxford is an educational town. Oxford has a university which is world famous, and people go to that town mainly for its education. So it's an educational town of its own. Religious, Varanasi. You ask anyone in India which is the religious place that you would like to visit. That's Banaras. So Varanasi, that is identified as religious town. Tourist town, Mussoorie. You ask any tourist where do you want to go, he will say Mussoorie or Himachal Pradesh. So you see, towns are also classified based on how do you perceive them and what kind of what is the most identifying feature of the town. But problems, as always, urban sprawl is a very dominating problem for urbanization. Urbanization is basically concretization or putting up houses. Once you start putting up a house, you see that more houses come up in those regions and it just keeps spreading from one region to another. Leads to a lot of problems we have discussed multiple times, deforestation and the habitat destruction. But you see here, this image very nicely captures what does urban sprawl mean. You basically have very little greenery left, you have a lot of roads and you have a lot of houses, and this is the sprawl is basically spreading. So urban sprawl is on rise with urbanization. Other than that, what issues do you have? You have water crisis, housing crisis. Water crisis, just go back and here and just think, if you have limited water supply, let's suppose groundwater is limited, and you have these many houses coming up, you are bound to reach water crisis with so many houses using water. Housing crisis, after a certain point of time you will have no space left. Social problems comes with different kind of people staying together. Vulnerable to disasters, you can imagine, right? If a disease outbreak is there, all of us will get affected, whoever stays in this region. Then you have pollution and waste management. Pollution, so let's not, I'm pretty sure everyone is already able to understand. Waste management, it's each of these houses have different kind of waste which is being generated. If not disposed properly, that can have their own issues. So all of these are though a very prominent like scope of problem that is there regularly in our country and outside the world. So this is what I was talking about. So if we know these problems, we can now go for something called sustainable settlement, where what do you see here? All the problems that we have so far today as well as in the previous sessions discussed, all of these can be tackled in different ways by doing slight modifications. So let's see here. So you have, this is called sustainable settlement. So you have buildings, of course, you have your own water resource, and then you also have electricity and all the basic requirements. Let's see why it's sustainable. So first of all, you have smart logistics and green supply chains. So all these supply chains, do you see these ships and all, you are promoting green energy there. These electricity grids are smart grids. Then all your transportation is very sustainable. So you have a railway here, you also see a ship here, you have roads but not that many, so you don't have pollution, but you do have roads here. So you have everything but in a very systematic manner. You have water efficiency because you are encouraging rainwater harvesting in every house. You are using resource efficient buildings. We have green chemistry coming up. We have buildings which are now more resource efficient. You have a community owned infrastructure. When you have a community owned infrastructure, everyone feels responsible for maintaining the infrastructure. So there is less damage and less repairment, and there is more care taken towards the environment. You have remanufacturing, upcycling, recycling is what we keep suggesting, so that's there. Then you have retrofitting existing buildings. So you don't basically just raise down a building. Whatever is there, you repurpose it and use it. So you don't ideally go for any raising or breaking down houses. You have renewable energy at community. So all the energy that you are using, water sources, energy, solar energy, all these are renewable sources, and that's exactly why all of these are efficient. You have a green space which allows plants to grow, trees to be planted, which makes you feel very good, and of course all the other benefits. And of course all of these have offices. You also put employment opportunities, and you have waste to energy plants. So all the waste management problem can also be tackled if you have plants where you can use the waste and you can generate energy out of it. So you see, yes, it looks like a very far-fetched plan, but if you start making simple changes, you can achieve such kind of settlements, and these could be very sustainable. And the whole idea of this entire course is to promote this idea that you can go for sustainable settlements. Right, and this is exactly where your lecture ended in this week's series, and with where I'll also end with these 10 questions for you to revise when you are looking for revision. And I'll quickly do this with you so that we finish it up quickly and we see each other next week. So the first question here is, which of these is not a rural settlement? Next is Vishakhapatnam is categorized as which kind of town? Mao is categorized as which kind of town? It's basically Dr. B.R. Ambedkar town in Madhya Pradesh. Which of these settlements can show different patterns? So you have different kind of settlements. What of this can show different pattern? If you're not clear, I will give you the answer. You can try, and then I will definitely let you know. And last is Singrauli. This can be categorized as which kind of town? Okay, so I've received your responses. Let me give you the answer and you can check if you were able to get it right. The first one is, which of these is not a rural settlement? Clustered, hamlet, dispersed are all rural settlement. Town becomes urban settlement. Vishakhapatnam is a transport town. Mao or Dr. Ambedkar Nagar in Madhya Pradesh is a garrison town. Which of these settlements show different patterns? So clustered is basically all these houses together, right? Now these houses together can be linear, they can be circular, they can be in oblong U shape or Y shape or different kind of pattern, but the idea is here that they all will be together, nucleated or clustered. They're all clustered together and in one continuous manner, right? Singrauli, which is again a town in Madhya Pradesh, this is a mining town. And the last set of questions for today. First is, which of these is not a cultural factor governing rural settlement? Bhilai can be categorized as which of these town? Altitude is a dash factor which governs rural settlement. And Oxford, as we have discussed, is a town which is categorized as. And Panna or Palli, these are what kind of settlement? We have discussed this, so this should be easy. Okay. So received your response A, B, D, C, C, and you got the
Absolutely right. Right. So the first one is, which one of this is not a cultural factor? Terrain is a physical factor. What kind of terrain you have determines what kind of settlement you will have. Bhilai is an industrial town, as we discussed. Altitude is a physical factor again, because terrain, altitude, these are all the properties of the place. So that's a physical property. Oxford is educational town, and Panna and Palli, as we discussed, these are hamlets. So they are their own settlements. They are their own, like how do I say it? Enclosed region and they are far off from the other part of the city. Right, that brings us an end to this week's lecture. We meet each other in the next session, which is the last session for this course. I also have an extra session which is the week after, that summarizes the entire 12th week of this course in 2 hours. So what I will try to do in those 2 hours is give you a mind map of all the lectures, how they are all interconnected, and what was the major theme in each of these. So that happens on 22 October. And next week we do the last lecture or the last module of this course. With that, today's session comes to an end. If you have any doubt, please let me know, or else we meet each other in the next session. Thank you so much for being here.